everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Global Guardian, Mitigating Risk in Latin America for Businesses and Travelers. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's panelists by typing your questions into the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording in a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Global Guardian Head of Research and Intelligence Manager, Zev Fantuk. Zev?
Thanks, Shannon, and welcome everyone to Global Guardian's third webinar of 2024. The topic today is mitigating risk in Latin America. Our focus will be on the unique security conditions companies and travelers will encounter visiting and conducting business in Central and South America. From a macro level, we will discuss the business environment and implications of gang violence and political instability. On a more tactical level, we will discuss measures that firms can employ to mitigate these risks when operating in Latin America. Next slide, please. Thanks. For those of you who may not be familiar with Global Guardian, we're a global security and medical support firm based just outside of Washington, D.C., with additional offices in Charlotte, North Carolina, and London, England. We pride ourselves in having built a network of vetted, trained, and tested local response teams in over 140 countries around the world. Global Guardian is a company that leverages technology, but ultimately, we're about people, helping people, with a hyper-responsive mentality and a commitment to providing options and positive outcomes to our clients. Next slide, please. Our first panelist, James Wiggins, is a CIA Senior Intelligence Service Executive and Operations Officer with 30 years of successful global operations leadership and management experience in demanding environments. James has served as CIA Chief of Station and Director of National Intelligence Representative in South America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, where he successfully built and led cross-functional teams to accomplish U.S. national security goals. James has deep experience in strategy development and execution, crisis management, risk mitigation, and negotiations. In recognition of his high-impact accomplishments in forging new diplomatic relationships and successfully navigating the release of foreign political prisoners, the DCIA awarded James the Distinguished Intelligence Medal. James obtained his MBA from the Kellogg Graduate School of Management at Northwestern University in 2004 and earned a BA in Political Economies of Industrialized Societies from the University of California, Berkeley in 1990. Our second panelist, Michael Ballard, currently manages Global Guardian's intelligence network with international partners. He's responsible for providing clients with Global Guardian's intelligence reports and real-time alerts. Prior to joining Global Guardian's team, Michael was the former lead intelligence analyst for the North American region at United Health Group. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from the University of Kentucky and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Mary Washington. Our third panelist is Ricardo Grave de Peralta, who is the Senior Director of Global Security at Smurfit Westrock. He served a combined 20 years as a Naval Special Warfare Officer, retiring in 2010 as a commander, completing 6 overseas deployments. His FBI career focused in the national security arena and included conducting and supervising investigations in counterintelligence, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and cyber matters. He served as an FBI legal attaché for 3 years at the U.S. Embassy in Canberra, Australia, as well as a deputy on-scene commander for FBI negotiations in Afghanistan. His last tour was as the assistant and acting special agent in charge of the FBI Atlanta Field Division. After retiring from the FBI in 2019, he joined Smurfit Westrock and has served in his role for the past 5 years. Our final panelist is the president and CEO of Global Guardian, Dale Buckner. Dale has led Global Guardian since its inception in 2012. He's a decorated combat commander with multiple tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, Haiti, Cuba, and many other locations. Dale served in the United States Army Infantry for 9 years, in military intelligence for 2 years, and his Special Forces Green Beret for 13 years. He earned a total of 27 awards in decorations, highlighted by his Combat Bronze Star Medal and Defense Meritorious Service. Dale has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and business and a master's degrees in public administration and business administration, and was a senior fellow at the Tufts University School of Law and Diplomacy. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to James. James?
Thank you, Zev, and thank you, Global Guardian, for hosting us today. I just returned from a decade in South America, and during that time, what I saw were great challenges. There are risks, but there's also a lot of opportunity. So if we can go to the slide on Latin America as an economic opportunity. Thank you, Shannon. Latin America is continuing its economic rebound from the negative effects of the pandemic. Strong international economic growth has created significant demand for the region's agricultural products, energy, and natural resources, and to a lesser degree, its labor, which has helped stabilize many countries' economies. So GDPs are on the rise. With this opportunity, there is also strong investment demand within Latin America for increased technology adoption and a parallel increase in U.S. tech sector presence in the region. Given the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic and security uncertainty in the South China Sea, there is also renewed interest by U.S. firms in infrastructure development and manufacturing investment in the region. There seems to also be some degree of Belt and Road fatigue by Latin American countries due to unfinished projects, disappointment, and other challenges caused by trying to implement infrastructure projects from afar. I'd also like to say that there's a lot of economic benefit to Latin American countries operating with the United States due to historical and cultural ties. And as they continue to fulfill some of these needs of manufacturing, they need upgrades. And there's also a big push right now within many countries to learn more and adapt the AI tools necessary to increase production efficiencies. While there are significant opportunities, there also continue to be significant challenges. And so there are current impediments to economic and social development as related on the next slide. There are persistent challenges that continue to impede greater economic and social development. Political and criminal violence continue to have a destabilizing impact and are cited as key drivers of illegal migration to the U.S. Lack of investment in education and infrastructure also challenge economic growth and innovation, and corruption and structural inefficiencies increase investment risk. This is also consistent for the region's two largest economies, Brazil, which is at about 2.5 trillion GDP per year, and Mexico with $2 trillion in GDP. What's interesting is combined, they're about the population size of the United States. There are many operational risks to consider, but these risks can be mitigated with the proper preparation and thought. The impediments to development closely correlate to the operational risk we have to consider. This may seem daunting, but many U.S. companies are successfully and profitably navigating these risks through a variety of smart operations and risk mitigation strategies. And so if we could go into, to consider the crime and safety, obviously, it's endemic in every country. And while a lot of the traveler threats are similar, a lot of the business ones are different depending on the political and economic atmosphere in each of those countries. And I know Mike is going to go into a great case on El Salvador. So while we can go into more detail on risk strategies and how to mitigate them, I think it's important to consider 5 themes as you look holistically at how you're going to enter and operate in each country that you're focusing on. And one is to always remember that by securing our people and our organizations, we're really a value creator. We're a profit center rather than a cost center. There's a lot to add to the value of ongoing operations when we keep our people safe, our infrastructure safe, the company's activities and assets safe. To maximize impact, I would suggest that it's important to identify probable risks instead of all the possible risks. Sometimes I think it's easy to focus too much on everything that could possibly go wrong, and often we receive questions about that. But to reserve our energy and our resources, it's really good after you look at sort of the scheme of possible risks to see what is really probable, and that way we can focus our energy on those. I would also suggest have someone test your assumptions, whether you're using a red team or a red cell, or identify a provocateur. As you look at those probabilities, it's important to have others from the outside look at them also to ensure that you're really focused on what matters and can have the highest impact. And then, as we talk about corruption and some of these other challenges, and ensuring that labor is being used appropriately and we're respecting the laws and human rights of other citizens, ensure the partners understand your mission, your values, what your expectations are for partnering with them in that country, and make sure that um, you approach it in a holistic sustainability manner, in that every firm obviously has to be financially sustainable, but you also want your people to be a part of the community that's sustainable. And today, it's also important to be environmentally sustainable. And then in a crisis, I would suggest take a moment to take a breath, gather your best brains, get off the X. You want to stop whatever the threat is immediately. And then you have to look also how to protect other people, the communities, and then the environment. And it's good to look at probably in that order, because you will be asked questions later and under scrutiny. So with that, I think we can really operate in a safe and productive manner in Latin America. And we can go into risk mitigation strategies. If anyone has a specific question later, I'd be more than happy to answer that. And Mike, I think you've got some great points on El Salvador, so I look forward to hearing your insights on that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James. So you can go to the next slide here. It's going to talk about what I think is a pretty interesting topic, and that is sort of the gang violence, cartel violence is a big deal, right? Not just in Mexico, but across Central and South America. And here we have just a snippet of our risk map from this past year with the, you can see moderate, medium, and high risk countries. But I'll focus in on Central America and Ecuador. Next slide, please. So something super interesting has been happening in El Salvador. You can see the homicide rates since 2015. It was, almost a war zone, right? Some of the gang violence that was happening there. And you can see that even before the president took office in 2019 and really implemented the sort of iron fist strategy of just, mass incarceration, you could see that the trend was already quite significantly downward, but you still have 40 murders per 100,000 people in 2019 and almost 60 in 2018. Those are still very, very high numbers. And if you look at where, for example, last year the country with the highest homicide rate in the region was Jamaica, right, at 61. You were almost double that in El Salvador back in 2015. So you had really, really significant issues with gang violence, with corruption. It was, a drag on the economy. And, what we're seeing now is a little bit of the spread of the El Salvador model, which is effectively a suspension of a lot of constitutional rights. Every male, I don't know exact numbers, but, 16 to 40 with tattoos is basically being rounded up and arrested, incarcerated. They've extended how long they can hold people without charges, right? Some 80,000 suspected gang members have been arrested, and that's a very significant part of their population. And you can see the homicide rate has dropped. I mean, not just dramatically, but, just an insane, really, statistical drop in homicides, right? They're now one of the lowest homicide rate countries in the world, not just in the region. There are concerns, of course, about human rights, about can this be sustained? Do they have the infrastructure to maintain this? That's a question that other countries are asking as well, right? So Honduras, for example, just recently, they've had a state of emergency that's been ongoing since 2022, but they haven't had the same impact on reducing violence as El Salvador has had. But they're looking at this year building a prison to double their prisoner population capacity, right? They want to add 20,000 kind of beds to be able to do, conduct mass arrests. They want to be able to do what Ecuador has recently done, which is designate gangs as terrorist organizations and effectively charge them en masse, almost like a RICO kind of statute. I don't know that Honduras is going to have the same level of success as El Salvador has had, strictly from a violence reduction perspective, simply because they haven't, and Ecuador is in the same situation there. They just haven't cracked down hard enough, so to speak, right? When you have such an issue as these gangs are entrenched, there's lots of corruption, as James mentioned. There's lots of institutional weakness. You don't have a lot of, not just arrests, but trials, convictions. You just don't have the same type of institutional strength that you have in other countries to be able to, utilize the laws and take advantage of the judicial system there. So Honduras and Ecuador are really going to have to, it's an all or nothing game, I think, for them. So TBD on whether this will really work for them, but what's gone on in El Salvador, the landslide re-election of President Bukele there, incredibly popular with the citizenry. So, it's not just a success story from a violence reduction perspective, but politically, it's a win for El Salvador. And I think these leaders in Ecuador and Honduras are seeing something similar. So I wouldn't be surprised if you do see Honduras and now Ecuador, right? They had a large incident with gang violence earlier this year. It spilled out into the streets. They stormed a television station, took hostages. Right after that, the government designated these gangs as terrorist organizations and basically deployed the military to try and crack down on them. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some other countries take a similar route, but the larger you get, right, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, it's going to be harder and harder for these countries to do something similar. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. To echo James and to Mike, Latin America presents some really promising business opportunities, particularly in the manufacturing section, which is where I sit with Smurfit Westrock. We're now, as of a week ago, the largest paper and packaging company in the world. The economic engine for our company is going to remain in North America, primarily in the US. However, we have now, in addition to the Smurfit facilities and our Westrock facilities, are looking at upwards of over 30 manufacturing sites in Mexico alone, in addition to countries such as Brazil, Ecuador, and Colombia. But with those opportunities, as James and Mike also just pointed out, there's a lot of additional challenges that need to be met in operating in this environment, in this area, in this region. And the way that we've looked at it, even before the merger that we went through, is to kind of take it in different stages. We first look at it from a geopolitical, force in terms of where are we looking at operating, what countries are we looking at, and what are those macro type factors that we have to consider. And as an example, we just had a number of elections throughout the world that Dale just talked to us about a couple months ago. And the most recent one occurring that impacts this region is the one in Mexico with the election of Claudia Sheinbaum. So what does that mean? Where is Mexico going to go now? What is the win? Is it going to be a continuation of the Manuel Lopez Obrador agenda. Many tend to think that, from what I've been reading, Scheinbaum is considered to be a protege of Lopez Obrador, which is probably a big reason why she won by such a significant margin. But the question then becomes, does she continue a lot of the same policies, some of which have not been very effective? For example, AMLO, as he was called, had a different approach to dealing with the cartels of hugs and not bullets. And the question is Scheinbaum going to continue down that path? Many believe that she will, and not engage the cartels perhaps in a confrontational manner that perhaps they need to be dealt with, which then persist with the dangerous environment that can persist in many of the Mexican states. I believe right now, the latest that I read is that 6 of the 32 states in Mexico are currently no-go zones for US government employees. And there's another roughly 20 states that are considered high risk. I know that many of the one big state that we have is Jalisco State, where we have a plant in Guadalajara, and we have to deal with that, as well as in Matamoros and some other areas. There are some indications, though, that perhaps as Scheinbaum moves forward in her presidency, she'll become more independent of Lopez Obrador. While she was mayor of Mexico City, she was successful during her tenure of bringing the violent crime down by 58% and the murder rate by 51%, simply by putting more police officers on the street and increasing their wages. And the reason why I emphasize that is, again, you have to understand the political environment, who's leading any particular country where you're looking at doing business. The other aspect I think that Scheinbaum's going to have to deal with, particularly in Mexico, is how will she be able to deal with the widespread corruption that seems to permeate all areas of conducting business in Mexico, both private and public? Is she going to confront that, and is there going to be a sea change or movement in the direction where that doesn't become as big of a problem? Even when you're considering the police forces and how she's going to deal with the cartels, she can't expect to nationalize the National Guard, put it under the DoD, and that's going to solve the problem. I think, as we find here in the U.S., that dealing with criminal elements has to begin at the local level. And right now, both state and city localized police forces have huge issues with corruption that's going to need to be dealt with. Other areas that as Mike just described, in Ecuador, dealing with a serious spike in crime. You may have seen on that slide that they're number 2 right now in terms of murder per capita per 100,000. Will this new young president in Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, be able to utilize the same controversial but effective tactics that Nayib Bukele in El Salvador has been able to implement and bring a safer environment for conducting business? Other considerations that have to be addressed are, countries that are at odds with each other. For example, Ecuador and Mexico are currently at odds because Ecuador effectively conducted a raid on the Mexican embassy in order to arrest their exiled vice president on corruption charges. And that created not just a problem between those 2 countries, but also in the region, and has even been elevated up to the United Nations. Next slide, please. So these macro environmental factors, once you take a look at those, the next thing that we have done is we've tried to then boil it down to a more micro level, not just within a country, but within the state itself of where we're considering conducting business. Where are we looking at putting perhaps a manufacturing plant, or are we in the process of doing a joint venture or buying assets from another company? Well, where do those exist? What state are they in? What's the risk level there, both for violence as well as for corruption? And then boiling it down even further, certain neighborhoods and even the industrial zone. And we have in the past conducted threat assessments to better understand what those environments look like. Even in Mexico, there are some states where you have plants that, the threat level is not nearly as high as in others. And I think that's a very important aspect to consider when you're conducting business in these environments. In Mexico, answers to questions such as what cartel is the dominant force in that area? Who are they competing with? What are their cartels? Are they competing with for territory and influence? Are those cartels perhaps working in conjunction with each other? That's has definitely happened before, but perhaps they're at war, or a previous truce or agreement has been broken, and things are about to go sideways. The other question to ask is, who are the political power players in that area? But, who are the state officials, the governors, the mayors of particular cities where you're looking at putting operations, city council members, and to what extent are they connected to, nefarious organizations? Are they corrupt, or are they trying to right the ship? I think one key influential aspect or red flag is that if that particular political figure has had an assassination attempt, they're probably trying to right the ship. Who are the union bosses in that area that are going to have influence on your workforce? And how are you going to deal with them? What are their connections to the political power players as well as to the cartels? The answer to these questions can provide insight into how you need to approach doing business in certain countries, the states and cities and towns within those countries. Again, even right down to the industrial zone or the industrial park that you're looking at putting a manufacturing site. And then the other aspect is, do struggling governments have a handle on preventing or countering issues such as human trafficking, forced labor, or counterfeiting and piracy? So the issues of principal concern that require a corporate global security engagement to mitigate risk. And on this slide, you'll see, no, go back one. Private and public corruption as it pertains to the Financial Federal Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. As a US-based company, if you're listed on the US Stock Exchange, even now post-merger for us, we are listed on the US exchange as opposed to London. So we're going to be subject to all US laws, regulations, and policies. If you're dealing in an area where corruption, particularly from certain governments, is an issue, you have to ensure that you're training your people, who are now your people, if you're acquiring them, for example, in a joint venture, or you've purchased another company like we did not too long ago with Grupo Grande, that our folks understand that these are the rules that we have to apply by so we don't get into trouble in that regard. Compromise of businesses, domestic businesses by criminal enterprises, cartels, gangs, which we've just discussed, under consideration for acquisition or for joint ventures. It's important to utilize companies like Global Guardian. There are other avenues or resources where you need to do your due diligence. I'll just tell you a little tale here. About a year ago, we were looking at purchasing a business, a manufacturing converting plant in the San Luis Potosi state of Mexico. Brand new 21st century plant, spotless, state of the art, couldn't be better. However, it had a golf course and a zoo attached to it. So obviously something like that would raise a lot of red flags, i.e. Pablo Escobar and his zoo behind his house with hippos in Colombia. Those type of things are fairly evident, but you have to make sure that you're digging deep and that those connections are vetted out. Protecting against infiltration of the domestic workforce by criminal enterprises. So, who's going to be working in your plant, and making sure that the folks that are going to come inside your perimeter are legitimate, that you're doing a thorough job of vetting the people that are going to come to work for you each and every day. We've had a number of incidents, particularly in Jalisco State and Guadalajara, where the cleaning crews that we've hired, unfortunately, have members that are cartel members. And we've been able to ferret them out and get them out of the plant. But, those are also considerations you have to think about. We go to the extent that in the high-risk states where we have manufacturing, we actually provide daily transportation for our employees, to and from work, in order to help them avoid being, on public transportation that are frequently robbed by regular street gangs, or are going to be subject to checkpoints that maybe the cartels are setting up. Mitigating risk of logistics transportation, compromise either by being victims of highway robbery or utilized to smuggle contraband. And for us, that is a particular concern for our manufacturing sites that are up and near the border. So since our recent acquisition of Grande about 2 years ago, most of the flow of our goods, our product, is going south of the border. However, we are soon going to be sending a lot of product back north of the border. The last thing you obviously want is for your logistics, your trucking, your transportation that is bringing your product to market to be compromised either, for narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, or counterfeit goods. It's also a matter of protecting, if you have a organic trucking organization within the company itself, or you're working with a vendor who trucks for you, protecting those truck drivers when they're on the road from highway robbery. And ensuring sourcing of raw material. I think this is a big issue that is going to come up as we move away from China and start manufacturing more in Latin America. For us, because fiber is a very important part of making paper, making container board, we need to be aware of where that fiber is being sourced. In Mexico, the vast majority of our fiber is from recycled material. However, in Ecuador, Colombia, further south, there are sources of fiber, one being the abaca fiber that is grown in Ecuador, and there have been plantations that have been brought to court for forced labor issues. The last thing you want to be is a company that has been associated with any kind of forced labor situation. So you need to ensure that your sourcing of your material, your raw materials, are legitimate, and that the companies that you're doing business with, your vendors, your sourcing is all on the up and up. And then finally, I think James mentioned this as well, the criminal threat to international business employees. In addition to, your domestic employees, what training are you providing to the people that have to live and work every day in an environment like Mexico or Ecuador, where the crime rate currently is very high? Colombia is also slipping from having been in a very good position to in a deteriorating fashion. What training are you providing them? Do you have crisis response plans, kidnap for ransom, those type of things in place? Ensuring that for our travelers, particularly, they have the Global Guardian app on their phone and that they know how to use it and they understand how it works. Next slide, please. And then finally, these are different areas that we've implemented to mitigate the risks that we just discussed. First and foremost is to create, push, and adhere to a corporate culture of integrity outlined in substantive policies. If you're now partnering with, just acquired a new company in any country down there, it's absolutely important for them to understand, how we're going to do business. In conjunction with that, your employees, your new employees in those countries need to have a means to report and communicate areas of concern, either incidents of fraud or corruption that they feel comfortable utilizing, and then investigating and addressing those issues. If you don't investigate, if you don't address the issue, if you don't show them that there are going to be repercussions and results, then you're never going to change the culture. A robust mechanism for understanding the environment and key players via threat assessments. Whether you utilize a company like Global Guardian to do those threat assessments, we try to use a number of different sourcings, so that way we have different aspects and different approaches. But understanding the environment, again, going back to what we talked about at that macro level and then shrinking it down to a more micro level. Conduct due diligence investigations utilizing respected organizations. Mentioned that before, making sure that, when you go into business with somebody, whether they're just going to be a supplier or whether you're looking at acquiring them, that everything is on the up and up. And then fundamental foundational security at your locations, right? Robust physical security, access controls, security officers, well-trained officers, CCTV. We even utilize canine inspections in order to prevent both narcotics and firearms from getting into our plants. Crisis response plans, which we talked about, and then also looking at participating in government and private sponsored security programs such as CTPAT, DSAC, the Domestic Security Alliance Council, sponsored by the FBI, as well as professional security management agencies like ISMA, the Information Security Managers Association. And then finally, provide personal security awareness training, both to your domestic and to their family members. We run this particularly in our higher risk countries. Every quarter, we conduct a virtual training opportunity for our employees and their family members to make them aware of what the particular threats are, what's developing, and how they should react. And with that, I will turn it back over to Zev.
Next slide, Shannon. This is Dale. Jim, Rick, thank you. I think obviously what Jim set up is the environment, and what Rick just described in that last slide. If I'm a CSO or an HR director or someone that is thinking about going into Latin America or trying to expand my protection into that part of the world, he just gave you the yellow brick road of success. I won't regurgitate what's on this slide other than to say, I think if you're in the audience and you're already operating in Latin America, there's nothing here we haven't told you. It might just re-energize the necessity as this expands. Also, if you're already operating in Latin America, I do think as people are nearshoring and leaving and mitigating that risk out of Asia, that you have to think, if you've been there for 20, 30, 40 years, there's going to be a competitive edge coming where labor and assets are going to, and it won't be immediate, but there's going to be a forecast where I think assets and people and infrastructure, there'll be competition for it in certain parts of Latin America. Lastly, as you think about if you're not in Latin America and you're thinking about it, obviously what Jim outlined is the environment. And for those of you that are there now, no surprise. I think ultimately what you should be thinking about is, and this is the mistake we see at corporate headquarters consistently, it's not just the spreadsheet and the financial analysis that has to occur if you're going to open up and start operating in Latin America. The message is simply this: there is an enormous opportunity in Latin America to expand and operate there. At the same time, be very, very realistic of everything Rick just took you through. The realities of what it's going to take to be able to operate there has to also be accounted for. If you can do both and you go in eyes wide open and you understand the environment and you understand what it's going to take to operate there and the environment, then I think you're on the right path. If you go in just basically on a financial assessment and you assume away these issues that you're going to face and the challenges of Latin America, you're going to end up with a very bad outcome. So I'll pause there. I'll hand it back to Zev for the Q&A. And as I always say, it's 10:37. We've got over 20 minutes here of Q&A, which is typically the best part of the webinar. Zev?
Great. Thanks, Dale, and thanks to the rest of our panelists. I just wanted to remind those of you in the audience, if you would like to submit a question, if you go down to the banner at the bottom of this, just select question and I'll be able to read them from there. Great. So just to kick things off here, the first half of our discussion, James did a wonderful job of describing some of the macro factors that make Latin America a pretty enticing place for investment, nearshoring, potential for tech investment, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative fatigue. But for you, James, what, if any, types of developments do you think might reverse these positive trends that we're seeing, or do you think they're here to stay?
I think generally they're here to stay, just because the amount of opportunity, whether it's the natural resources, it's the energy potential, it's the labor potential. But if we were to look at potential disruptors, which could complicate either entering or sustaining operations in these countries, I think first and foremost is the political stability. Anytime there's a change of administrations, you have the chance, particularly in Latin America, of pretty extreme policy changes. I think one way to mitigate that risk, and we've all touched on this, is building the institutional relationships so that you have other corporate players or entities within the country which you're operating to help inform and protect your operations through any political changes. I think as there are some populist movements, there is a lot of monetary policy instability, which can lead to inflationary pressures, which have operating consequences just for the costs of basic operations, your energy, and also can negatively impact your workforce as they confront those day-to-day living challenges. And again, as Rick said, as long as you maintain good insight into your employees and the local political situation, you can also help mitigate that. It also means being a very good steward of the community when you consider operating in these, so that you don't become a scapegoat for any potential issues that are arising locally, but are connected to national political movements. Um, Another thing that could reverse trends, unfortunately, is greater global conflict, which might draw partisan lines between countries. There are some very tough countries in South America that have been able to maintain autocratic regimes. You know, Dale has experience in Cuba. Venezuela continues to be a challenge because they're looking to break out of sort of the democratic traditional mode of the West and affiliate more. But overall, I think the opportunities and the economic momentum are in favor of creating opportunities, particularly for U.S. companies to operate in Latin America. And again, just as Rick and Dale and Mike laid out, there are a lot of different mitigating risk mitigation strategies, robust security protocols, building those local and national relationships, investing in staff training, your due diligence, but also really focusing on those corporate social responsibility goals, so that you can operate without drawing international criticism, I think are key.
Great. Thank you very much. And I guess speaking of ESG, environmental, social, and governmental factors, we've mentioned some of the social and governmental factors, but can you maybe talk us through a little bit of some of the climate risks and climate factors that might impact those operating in Latin America?
Absolutely, Zeb. So being located in California, I think we're facing here on the West Coast many challenges related to potential climate change that we can encounter throughout the world and in Latin America. You've seen recent fires in the Southern Cone in Chile that disrupted a lot of transportation and had infrastructure impacts. The same in southern Brazil, lots of flooding in Santa Catarina that disrupted agricultural production. I think, and Rick probably has great insight into this, as you look for locations to expand operations or new facilities, we're going to have to be really conscious of stable power grids and the availability of consistent energy supply. And if there is a disruption, what are the plan Bs and Cs? And going back to the community, we don't want to ever be seen as taking resources from local communities that can create a political issue and maybe some headwinds to our operations. And then water. A lot of manufacturing uses a lot of water. Again, we have to be really conscious about a consistent supply, especially if those are being impacted by climate change, and then be willing to partner with local, state, or larger governments to ensure those stable utility supplies, whether it's electric or water or natural gas, that you need to continue operation. Again, if you go in with eyes wide open and invest in the planning and these relationships, I think we can mitigate a lot of the climate or risk changes associated with operating in South America.
Great. Thanks for those insights. This question is for you, Rick. Since you're you're a current practitioner here in the private sector, what advice would you give to someone who's just assuming the role of a regional security manager for operations in Latin America?
So I think the first thing I would say, whether you're stepping into a role that already exists with a company that, already has operations there, or whether the company is now looking at expanding into a particular area or country, is to understand your environment, right? You need to come in and understand, if you're already operating there, where are we operating, right? What countries, what locations, what states, what are the issues that we mentioned during the briefing that are of particular concern, right? What are those big risks? And how, if we're already operating there, what have we done to mitigate them? Are they being effective? If they're not, what other steps do we have to take to bring that risk down and make the company operate more efficiently by mitigating those risks? If the company is looking at expanding into a new area, then again, I would go back to, you have to do a thorough assessment of the region that you're looking at going into. What's it look like? If you're going into Ecuador right now, right, you have to consider that there's a lot of turmoil in terms of the criminal aspect. Are they going to be successful in mitigating that? How does that going to impact our business? Where are we looking at putting a facility? Right now, Guayaquil, which used to be a fairly benign location with great port facilities, very manufacturing friendly, is right now having a lot of issues. Do we really want to invest in that location right now? What does that balance look like? Right? You have to understand that. And what mitigation steps you've taken. What other assets do you have available to you as a security officer or as the chief security officer for a company that you can apply there? Do we need to bring in extra resources if we're going to be expanding, right? Or even if we're already there, is what we have enough? Is it sufficient? Do we need more expertise on the ground because there's too much to deal with? So I think that's the first and foremost, understanding your environment. If you don't understand it, how can you solve the problem?
Great, thanks. And speaking of this operating environment, I'm going to kind of go around the room here, but in a large part, we've kind of discussed from the point of view from corporate offices of best practices. But I was wondering, I guess we'll start with in the same order of speaking here, if all of you guys could quickly just go through some best practices for those just traveling to Latin America.
Sure. I think and initially, if it's your first time, definitely have the partners, whether it's a company you're working with or a trusted facilitator such as Global Guardian on the other side to walk you through that. Whether it's having the Global Guardian app on your phone or other emergency resources available, but a couple key things. Stay in brand known hotels. It's not the time to find your new sort of expressive self and go off and explore alone. These are for your first trips. Build up the confidence. Be street aware. Don't spend a time out alone. Have the infrastructure available and contacts available to reach out in an emergency. I think these are all general practices that new travelers should undertake. An experienced traveler, right, has the additional potential threat if they are a high executive or a high net worth individual, that if they create a pattern or become known, then we have to layer on additional security protocols to protect them while allowing them the greatest extent of movement and interaction possible. So it's sort of bifurcated there. There are a lot of resources out there to help guide people through that. But again, it shouldn't limit travel, but we just have to do it smartly.
Yeah, I would echo what James has said. And one of the things that I've done here with Smurf at West Rock is when we had entered into a joint venture with Grupo Grande in 2015 before I came on board. 2 years ago, we exercised the option to purchase the rest of the company. So we had a lot of U.S.-based personnel traveling to Mexico that don't typically travel there. I developed a security briefing, basically 2 slides that went step by step on what the risks were and how to and what steps to take to mitigate the risks. James brought up a great point. We utilized and tapped into the resources that we already had in Mexico, as well as with Global Guardian, to say, in this particular location, San Luis Potosi or Celaya or Guadalajara or Mexico City, what hotels should we be putting our people at? What are the ones that are safe? We also then constructed a transportation plan. If the risk is high in a certain area, fortunately for us, we had organic executive protection assets that could move people. If those were not available, we would have people from the company that would function as, picking them up, moving them from one location to another because they know the area, they're familiar with it. And then also ensuring that all of our travelers have the app on their phone. So that way they can tap into, they have that connection, they have that tether in case they get into trouble. Those were all very important aspects of building our traveler program as we increased our frequency going into Mexico in particular.
Great, thank you. So, in regard to political corruption and instability, how has the election of President Javier Milei affected Argentina's safety and potential for it to be a attractive attractive place for businesses to consider expanding to? We can start with James, and anyone else, please feel free to chime in.
President Milei is a very interesting character if you follow what has been going on in Argentina. And there's this heterodoxical economic policy. He promised to dollarize the economy, which I think would actually greatly assist operating there, but to date has not been able to due to political pushback and the protests there. He is a controversial figure, and this is one of those issues, the political instability that needs to be resolved, I think, further before investing a lot of resources in the country. It is a fantastically rich country, a great labor force, but with hyperinflation right now, it's very difficult to meet expectations of the local labor force. And I think there's still potential for some disruption, though the international community and the IMF, I believe, are supporting the dollarization plan, which should help ameliorate some of these concerns.
Great, thanks. This question's for Rick. Would you please be able to provide recommendations on some of the nuts and bolts of creating or expanding a local security network?
Creating or expanding a local security network. I think the first thing I do rely heavily on my director of security in Mexico, who has 20 years of experience down there. He has the connections both with state and federal government officials that is able to, for us, get armed guards at our facilities. And I'm not saying that armed guards are necessary at all facilities in all states. It's all driven by the risk in any particular location. But it's how we chose to stand up our security, and it not only, I think, helps prevent perhaps the approach of nefarious organizations, whether it's street gangs or more formalized cartels, from engaging us, but it makes our workforce feel more secure. They have often come to say that there's no point at which they feel safer than when they're at work because of what we've been able to create there. There are legitimate, vetted private security agencies in Mexico that do a good job of vetting their employees to ensure that they're not compromised. They are often, it's sort of a mishmash. A lot of them are run and organized or regulated by specific states. And then there are federal agencies and regulations that have, say in terms of how they operate. It's very interesting. And in fact, over the last number of years that I've been here, I'm still learning all the intricacies and the nuances of how they operate in different states and who can be armed and who can't. But if you're starting off from scratch, then I would recommend utilizing, if you have connections in ISMA, for example, and connecting with folks like us that have operations there, then tap into that resource, see who they're using, who they've used in the past, how they like them, what issues, good and bad, that they've had, to help guide you along in that process.
Great, very detailed answer. Thank you very much for that. This one's for you, Dale. So, in the last 12 months, we've seen mass unrest in several different countries. Quite frankly, bizarre coup attempt, some major prison breaks, and Mexico's bloodiest election. What do you think, if you could look into your crystal ball, are going to be some of the next surprises in store for us in Latin America in the coming next several months or coming few years.
Yeah, obviously this is not guaranteed what I'm about to say, but I do think, and this came up, Rick, you mentioned we had a discussion with another organization last week. This concept that there could the potential of a conflict with Venezuela claiming oil fields onshore and offshore with Guyana. And I had stated to the audience that I thought this could be a flashpoint. Now, whether that flashpoint leads to Western or US intervention, and I posed the question to the audience, would we go to war over this? Would there be a conflict? And my framing for that is very similar. Is this a Grenada-like invasion? Is this like a Haiti-like invasion? Is this like Panama, right? A short duration, basically separates both sides, if you will, stops that invasion of the oil fields. Is that feasible? So when I look at the region, when you look at like a large scale or largest scale conflict that could happen in the region as a flashpoint, that's the first thing that I pose to the audience, and I would pose to this audience equally is, if you're following that, the rhetoric has been quite high. It kind of hasn't come down. And my question is, overarching is, if Venezuela pulled that, Maduro pulled that trigger, and they actually tried to take those oil fields, both onshore and offshore, what would the West or the US do? And would we intercede? And how much pressure would come from the oil and gas sector? Because all the major players, not all, but a majority of the major players have some operations involved right now in Guyana, what's been discovered and expanding. So I think that's where the political pressure comes, and it would create a real problem for the US. And whoever wins the next presidential election, it won't matter who is in office or the administration is. This is going to be a material question. And to be frank, about 50-50 of the previous audience we had thought, yes, we would intervene. About 50% said we would not. So it's a really hard problem set with a really hard question. The other, or to pivot off of that as a major flashpoint, I think just in general, you're going to continue to see, again, whatever the administration is, this hot button issue of immigration throughout the region going north to the United States is not going to go away. And it's not magically going to disappear. And the United States has real infrastructure problems on its immigration policy that were so polarized that issue is not going to be solved anytime soon with whoever occupies the White House next. And it's a real issue, and it's not going to go away. So I think those things, Zev, are things between a actual conflict, the potential of an actual conflict with Venezuela, Guyana, and what is our response? And two, the immigration policy in the United States, we never seem to be able to politically come to any real conclusion to move the needle to make it better. And I just don't think that is going to go away anytime soon. And it's creating an enormous amount of stress throughout the region. And there's no simple answer here.
Great. Thank you very much, Dale. Really appreciate the answer. It's 11:58, so I think this is probably an appropriate pace to conclude things for the day. So that's it, folks. Thank you very much for attending. You'll receive follow-up emails, including links to the video recording and briefing slides. And very importantly, I would just like to thank our panelists, James Wiggins, Michael Ballard, Ricardo Grave de Peralta, and Dale Buckner for their expert insights and commentary. And we hope to see you at our next webinar.